What if everything you believed was a lie? What if you were chosen for a purpose beyond your comprehension? Margaret Bonner of Grand Prairie, Texas, was a simple woman with a simple life, but a dream, a whisper in the night, would lead her down a path where faith, destruction, and salvation would intertwine. A prophecy foretold of a battle between light and darkness, and Margaret would find herself standing at the very center of it. With Jesus Christ by her side and the fate of humanity hanging in the balance, would she be able to confront the forces of evil in time, or would darkness prevail? Margaret Bonner's life in Grand Prairie, Texas, had always been ordinary. She worked at a local bookstore, spent Sundays at the church, and lived a peaceful existence. But one evening, as she closed the store for the night, she felt a strange tug in her chest, a sense that something was about to change. That night, as she slept, a voice whispered to her in a dream, "You are the chosen one. The time has come. The fate of the world rests in your hands." Startled, Margaret awoke, sweating and breathless. The voice, powerful yet calming, had given her a sense of urgency but no clarity on what she was meant to do. She dismissed it as just another strange dream. Little did she know, this was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she believed in and lead her into a war between good and evil. The days following the dream were filled with confusion. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that could alter the course of history. It wasn't until a stranger walked into the bookstore that the pieces started to come together. He was tall, wearing a long coat, with eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. He introduced himself as Gabriel. His calm demeanor and steady presence instantly put her on edge, but in a way that felt strangely comforting. "Margaret Bonner," Gabriel said, "the time has come for you to fulfill your purpose. You have been chosen by God. A great darkness is approaching, and you will play a pivotal role in stopping it." Gabriel revealed a scroll, ancient and worn. The text on it was in a language Margaret couldn't recognize, but the symbols were unmistakable. This was the prophecy of the last battle, a conflict that would determine the fate of all humanity. "The darkness is led by a man named Azazel," Gabriel explained. "He is risen again, empowered by forces that seek to bring the world to its knees. He is a servant of the devil, and he seeks to open a portal that will unleash hell upon earth." Margaret's world flipped upside down. She never considered herself religious, let alone capable of taking part in such a grand battle. But Gabriel insisted, "Your faith is your weapon. It is your shield." Over the next few days, Margaret began her training. She learned about her abilities, how to harness her spiritual power, how to fight with strength and conviction. Gabriel was her mentor, but he was not the only one who appeared to help her. Other warriors, men and women who had been chosen by God, gathered around her to prepare for the war ahead. These were the Sentinels of Light, a group that had been waiting for Margaret's arrival. Among them was a man named Thomas, who was known for his remarkable strength and combat skills, and Rachel, a priestess who had spent years studying the ancient scriptures. They all told her one thing: "You are the sword of God." What do you think Margaret's next move will be? Comment below with your theories and predictions. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to follow her journey as she faces the darkness. Join us for the next chapter, the Battle of Light and Shadow. The first sign of darkness arrived as a series of unexplained events. People in Grand Prairie began to vanish, their families desperate for answers. Strange creatures, pale and twisted, appeared on the outskirts of town. Margaret and her group soon realized that Azazel's influence had already begun to spread. Rachel, the priestess, recognized the signs. "This is just the beginning. Azazel's cult is growing. They'll stop at nothing to bring forth the final destruction." Margaret stood at the front of the group, holding her sword, ready for the fight to come. As the group ventured deeper into the heart of the enemy's territory, they encountered a powerful figure, Jesus Christ himself. His appearance was nothing like Margaret had imagined. He was not the gentle man of peace she had seen depicted in paintings. Rather, he was a mighty warrior, radiating divine light. "You are not alone in this," Jesus spoke, his voice echoing in the silence of the forest. "You have my power within you. Trust in me, and I will guide you." With his blessing, Margaret felt an overwhelming strength flood her. Her sword, once ordinary, now glowed with holy light, imbued with the power to defeat the evil that lay ahead. The battle against Azazel's minions had left the Sentinels of Light battered, but not broken. Despite their victory in the initial clash, Margaret could sense that this was just a small skirmish in a far larger war. Darkness loomed over the horizon, and Margaret could feel the weight of the prophecy crushing her every step. "Margaret," Gabriel said one evening, his face grave, "there is something more to this. Azazel's influence is growing faster than we anticipated. He's not just a puppet of evil. He's preparing for something far worse." The room fell silent. The urgency was palpable. Suddenly, Margaret's phone buzzed. It was an alert from an anonymous source. The message read, "The door is opening. He is coming." No signature, no explanation. Margaret couldn't shake the eerie feeling. In the days that followed, news outlets began to report strange events around the world, earthquakes, storms, and political upheavals. It seemed like the world was unraveling at the seams. Margaret had to act fast. But how? Gabriel placed his hand on her shoulder, offering comfort. We must meet with those who can help us. We must find allies. Margaret knew there was one man she needed to speak with, someone who had the influence and power to make a difference. It was a long shot, but she knew what needed to be done. She arranged for a covert meeting with none other than President Donald Trump. Gabriel, Rachel, and Thomas traveled with her to Washington, D.C. under the guise of a diplomatic mission. They met in a private, undisclosed location, far from prying eyes. President Trump greeted them with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. I've heard rumors. People say the world is in danger. Tell me what's going on. I'm not one for superstition, but if something real is happening, I want to know. Margaret shared the story. The ancient prophecy, Azazel's return, the portal, and the war between good and evil. Trump listened intently, his face serious. If what you say is true, then we need to fight back. I've seen corruption in places that most people can't even imagine. But if it's as bad as you say, I'll do everything in my power to stop it. In that moment, Margaret saw the man for what he truly was, a leader, with the weight of the world on his shoulders, but willing to stand for what was right. We'll help you, Trump promised. You have the support of this country, but we need to act fast. The next few days were filled with frantic planning and secretive operations. Trump mobilized key military forces and began investigating Azazel's cult, which had infiltrated various levels of society. Meanwhile, Margaret and her group began to gather more powerful allies, both political and spiritual. But time was running out. On the 7th day after the meeting, the unthinkable happened. The portal Azazel had been trying to open finally cracked wide open. The skies darkened, and the earth trembled. All across the world, people reported seeing flashes of hellish red in the sky, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Margaret and her team rushed to the site of the portal, a remote location in the middle of a desert. As they arrived, they were met by a force unlike anything they had ever encountered. Monstrous demons and twisted creatures pouring out of the portal, their eyes filled with hatred and malice. The time has come, Azazel's voice echoed from the other side of the rift. You cannot stop what has been set in motion. Margaret gripped her sword, her heart pounding. She knew that this was the final battle. If they failed, everything would be lost. The battle was fierce. Margaret, Gabriel, Rachel, Thomas, and their newfound allies fought valiantly against the onslaught of demons pouring from the portal. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and the sounds of battle. The ground shook beneath their feet as the forces of darkness clashed with the light. Trump, fully committed to the cause, had sent in military forces to help defend the site. Armed with advanced weapons, they held the line, but the demons were relentless. Margaret! Gabriel shouted as a demon lunged at her. With a swift motion, she raised her sword, and the creature disintegrated in a burst of holy light. But more were coming. Azazel, standing at the edge of the portal, was growing more powerful with each passing moment. The evil that emanated from him was suffocating, and Margaret could feel it trying to pull her into despair. But she had something Azazel did not, a faith stronger than anything he could comprehend. As the battle raged on, Margaret found herself momentarily separated from the others. She was surrounded by demons, their gnarled faces snarling at her, ready to strike. But in the midst of the chaos, a thought came to her, an ancient prayer that had been passed down through generations. Father in heaven, I call upon your strength. I stand before you as your servant, unyielding in the face of evil. I am but your instrument. Use me now to bring your light to the darkness. As she spoke the words, a divine power surged through her. The demons shrieked, retreating in fear as the light from Margaret's sword grew brighter than ever before. The air hummed with holy energy, and she knew that this was the moment that could end the war. Margaret faced Azazel, her sword raised high. He sneered, unfazed by her presence. You are nothing, Azazel taunted. You are weak, a mere human. You cannot stop me. But Margaret was no longer just a mere human. She was the chosen, the one destined to strike down evil itself. With a cry, she lunged toward Azazel. The battle between light and darkness erupted in a blinding explosion of energy. Azazel's scream echoed as he was consumed by the holy fire emanating from Margaret's blade. His twisted form disintegrated into nothingness, and the portal began to collapse. No, Azazel cried, but it was too late. With his defeat, the dark forces lost their power, and the portal closed for good. Margaret stood alone on a hill overlooking the ruins of the battlefield. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. The war had been won, but the cost weighed heavily on her. She could feel the loss in her soul. The lives of brave men and women, including some of her closest allies, had been taken to rid the world of Azazel's evil. The portal that had once threatened to unleash hell had been sealed. The demons were no longer a threat, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was still looming. As much as she wanted to believe that the battle was over, deep within her heart, she knew that the forces of darkness never truly rested. "Margaret!" a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Gabriel approaching, his expression somber. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice tired but resolute. "For now," Gabriel replied, "but we cannot afford to relax. The victory may have sealed Azazel, but the war against evil is eternal." Margaret nodded. "Then we continue fighting. There's more to be done." Gabriel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Indeed, but take a moment to grieve. Even the strongest warriors need time to heal." As they stood together, the world seemed to hold its breath. The victory was sweet, but there was no time to revel in it. Soon, they would need to return to Washington, where President Trump had been waiting for an update. The journey back to Washington, D.C. was quiet. The air felt heavy with the weight of their victory, but also the unresolved tensions that lingered. Margaret and Gabriel, along with the surviving Sentinels, arrived at the White House to debrief President Trump and his top advisors. Trump greeted them with a firm handshake. "I don't know what to say," he began. "You've done what many thought was impossible. You've stopped the apocalypse from happening." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward him, but also a nagging doubt. There was no time to relax. They had seen the way the forces of darkness had infiltrated every aspect of society, from political corruption to religious extremism. "There's more, Mr. President," she said. "Azazel might be gone, but we've only just begun. The darkness is insidious. It will find a way back. We need to prepare." Trump nodded gravely. "I'll back you, Margaret. You've got the full support of this administration. We'll work together to ensure that we're ready for whatever comes next." As the meeting ended, Gabriel turned to Margaret with a worried expression. "The battle was won, but it is not the end. There are those who will try to harness Azazel's power." Margaret glanced at Trump, knowing that his involvement would be crucial in the days ahead. But there was something more, something that had been gnawing at her. Days after their meeting, Margaret received disturbing news. A shadowy figure known only as Father Malachi had emerged from the remnants of Azazel's cult. This man was no ordinary priest. His power was dark, his mind twisted by years of study in forbidden texts. Malachi had begun gathering followers, preaching about the return of Azazel and the impending end of days. Father Malachi's sermons were broadcast across the internet and television, gaining a large following of disillusioned people who believed in the prophecy of destruction. He claimed that the only way to stop the coming tribulation was to embrace the darkness, to join forces with him and bring about the New World Order. The world was spiraling again into chaos. Margaret and her group knew that they had to stop Malachi before he could gather more power. "We need to find him," Margaret said, "before it's too late." Trump, who had been monitoring the situation closely, spoke up. "I've got intelligence gathering teams on it. We'll find him. But this time we need to be smarter. We can't afford to make the same mistakes." The Sentinels of Light, along with a small military team, followed the trail of Father Malachi to a remote, dilapidated church in the mountains. It was a place that seemed forgotten by time, hidden away from the world. As they approached, the air grew colder, and the sense of dread thickened. "This is it," Gabriel said. "This is where it all begins. We have to act quickly." Margaret's pulse quickened. This was more than just a church. It was a stronghold of evil, a place where dark rituals were practiced. Inside, they found a large group of people, all gathered in silence. Malachi stood at the altar reading from a dark text, his voice reverberating through the walls. The air was thick with unholy energy. "We're too late," Thomas whispered. "He's already performing a ritual." Margaret stepped forward, her sword glowing with divine light. "Not while I'm here!" With a swift motion, Margaret swung her sword, cleaving through the air. The light from her blade illuminated the room, dispelling the darkness. The followers of Father Malachi screamed in terror, fleeing as the power of the sword overpowered the darkness in the room. Father Malachi, enraged, turned to face her. "You think you can stop me? You have no idea what's coming." "I have the strength of the Lord on my side," Margaret said, her voice unwavering. The final battle between Margaret and Father Malachi was fierce. The darkness surged in the form of dark energy, but Margaret's light was brighter, stronger. She chanted prayers of power, each word echoing with divine strength. With one final swing of her sword, Father Malachi was consumed by holy fire, his body disintegrating as he cried out in anguish. With Malachi's death, his followers scattered, but the danger was far from over. Margaret, Gabriel, and the Sentinels returned to Washington, where Trump's administration had been working to restore order. But now, a new threat arose. The faithful, the true believers of God's power began to unite. Churches across the country started holding prayer rallies, preaching about the need for unity in the face of the ongoing battle against evil. A new pastor, Reverend Joseph Shaw, rose to prominence, uniting both spiritual and political forces. He was an inspiring figure, a man of deep faith and conviction. His words echoed across the nation, calling for people to come together in prayer and action to fight the darkness that still loomed. "I believe God has placed us in this time for a reason," Reverend Shaw proclaimed at a large rally. "We are His instruments, His warriors in the fight against evil, but we need to be ready for whatever comes next. We need to stand firm." Trump, who had supported Shaw's ministry, saw the potential for real change in America. "We will not let evil take hold of this nation. We will fight with faith and strength, and we will emerge victorious." Days passed, and the forces of good began to unite. Margaret and Gabriel led the Sentinels, training new warriors. Trump's administration worked behind the scenes to support the efforts of the church and strengthen the political and military apparatus against the dark forces that still threatened. But then, news broke that a new alliance was forming, an alliance of dark cults under the leadership of a new, mysterious figure known only as the Prophet. He was said to be a man who had mastered forbidden magic and had the power to control people's minds. The Prophet's influence spread quickly, reaching across the nation. The tension was palpable. Margaret knew that the next battle would be even harder. The day arrived when the forces of good and evil would converge in a final, catastrophic battle. Margaret stood alongside Trump, Gabriel, Reverend Shaw, and the Sentinels, preparing for what would be the greatest fight of their lives. The skies darkened, and the air was heavy with the weight of impending war. "We can't fail now," Trump said, his voice firm. "The future of the world is at stake." Gabriel nodded. "The Lord is with us. We will not falter." As the battle began, Margaret felt a surge of divine energy within her. Her sword blazed with holy light as she led the charge into battle. The Prophet's forces were formidable, but they were no match for the power of faith. One by one, the cultists fell, and the darkness began to recede. As the final battle raged, Margaret faced off against the Prophet. He was a man twisted by power, his eyes glowing with unnatural energy. But Margaret's faith was stronger. With one final prayer, she drove her sword through the Prophet's chest, ending his reign of terror. The forces of darkness were vanquished, and the light of God shone through once more. The world had been saved, but the fight was far from over. The world had been saved. Darkness had been driven back, and the forces of evil had been defeated. But for Margaret Bonner, the victory felt bittersweet. The days following the battle were filled with mourning, as the true cost of their triumph became apparent. Many lives had been lost, and some wounds could never fully heal. It had been several weeks since the last battle, and Margaret stood quietly by the gravesite of her fallen comrades, the sentinels who had fought alongside her, the soldiers who had died in defense of truth and justice, and the countless innocents who had perished in the wake of the conflict. The wind whispered softly through the trees, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Yet beneath the peaceful scene, there was a deep sadness in Margaret's heart. She walked slowly through the cemetery, her footsteps soft against the earth, her hand grazing the names etched on the headstones of those she had loved. Thomas, Gabriel, Sarah, James, Father Michael, their faces flickered in her mind, memories of their last moments, of their courage and sacrifice. Each name was a reminder that while the battle for the world had been won, it had come at a steep price. As Margaret knelt before one of the graves, a warm hand rested on her shoulder. She looked up to see Reverend Joseph Shaw, the pastor who had become a beacon of hope throughout the nation in the wake of the battle. His face was kind, but there was sorrow in his eyes. "You've done all you could, Margaret," he said softly. "But now we must remember them with gratitude, not sorrow." Margaret nodded but said nothing. The pain of losing those she cared about was overwhelming, and no words could ease the ache in her heart. Yet she knew that the battle had been necessary. The darkness had been kept at bay, and the world had been spared. But it wasn't just the fallen warriors she grieved. It was the loss of a sense of peace, the uncertainty of the future. The victory had not eradicated evil, but only temporarily delayed it. New threats were already emerging like the whispering shadows on the horizon. Would it ever truly end? "There's more work to be done, isn't there?" she asked, her voice quiet but resolute. Reverend Shaw nodded. "Yes, but we do not fight alone. The Lord walks with us, and as long as we have faith, we will overcome whatever comes next. God's plan is greater than any of us, and His light will guide us." Margaret stood, wiping away the tears that had formed in her eyes. She turned to face him, her heart swelling with both sorrow and strength. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. As the months passed, Margaret's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The world had started to rebuild itself, slowly but surely. People were coming together, and the country had started to heal, but there was still so much work to be done. New leaders were emerging, those who had been inspired by the actions of Margaret, Gabriel, and President Trump. But there was also a deep need for spiritual restoration. Across the nation, church attendance surged as people turned to God for comfort and strength. Faith was rising like a tide, sweeping through the hearts of the people. The dark cults had been scattered, but there were still pockets of hatred, fear, and division to confront. Yet, Margaret found solace in the knowledge that she wasn't alone in this mission. As the days grew longer and the world moved forward, Margaret found herself standing in front of a new generation of sentinels, young men and women whose hearts burned with the same fire she once had. They were the future, the warriors who would carry the mantle of righteousness and defend against the forces of evil. Margaret had become their mentor, teaching them not just how to wield a sword or fight in battle, but how to stand firm in their faith. It was a new dawn, a dawn of hope. She had seen the destruction that had come before, and she had felt the weight of the loss. But she also saw the rebuilding of lives, the restoration of families, and the strengthening of faith. There was a future, one that, despite the darkness, had been reclaimed. One evening, Margaret stood alone on the balcony of her home in Grand Prairie, looking out at the vast expanse of stars above. The city was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in a long time, she could breathe deeply, knowing that the world was not yet lost. She reflected on the journey she had taken, the battles she had fought, and the lives she had touched. She had seen the worst of humanity, but she had also seen the best. She had seen people rise above fear and hatred, uniting under the banner of love, faith, and God's grace. And then a thought crossed her mind. What if this was only the beginning? The world was changing. Darkness was always a threat, but so was the light. And while she didn't know what lay ahead, she had faith that she would be ready. She had learned that no matter how overwhelming the darkness seemed, the light of God was always brighter, always stronger. She closed her eyes for a moment, praying a silent prayer of thanks. Lord, guide me, guide all of us. Lead us in this new era of faith, hope, and love. A single tear fell down her cheek, but it was not one of sorrow. It was a tear of gratitude. As the years passed, Margaret continued to serve the Lord, fighting for what was right and raising up the next generation of warriors. The world, though imperfect, had been given another chance. Evil would always seek to corrupt, but good had found a home, a refuge in the hearts of those who would not yield. The victory over Azazel and the subsequent battle against Father Malachi had not been the end. It had been the beginning of something far greater. A movement, a new dawn of righteousness was spreading across the globe. Margaret Bonner had become a living testament to the power of faith, the strength of God, and the resilience of the human spirit. Her journey was far from over. What do you think of Margaret's incredible journey? How do you see the future unfolding for her and the new generation of warriors? Leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts and ideas. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more thrilling adventures of faith, heroism, and divine purpose. God's work is never done, and neither is Margaret's. Stay tuned for the next chapter.